Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, paragraph 17. In my view, which can be justified only by the exposition of the system itself, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. At the same time, it is to be observed that substantiality embraces the universal, or the immediacy of knowledge itself, as well as that which is being, or immediacy for knowledge. If the conception of God as the one substance shocked the age in which it was proclaimed, the reason for this was, on the one hand, an instinctive awareness that in this definition, self-consciousness was only submerged and not preserved. On the other hand, the opposite view, which clings to thought as thought, to universality as such, is the very same simplicity, is undifferentiated, unmoved substantiality. And if, thirdly, thought does unite itself with the being of substance and apprehends immediacy or intuition as thinking, the question is still whether this intellectual intuition does not again fall back into inert simplicity and does not depict actuality itself in a non-actual manner. So this is probably one of the densest paragraphs in the preface, and it starts with that very, very famous formula that kind of defines, I think, Hegel's intellectual mission. Grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. And there's, I think, we could, I guess from the outset, we could try and unpack that roughly as, trying to avoid the trappings of simply a naive materialism or a naive idealism. Substance versus subject. It sounds very close to, body versus mind. And Hegel aims to show the unity, the ultimate unity of both of those sides. So overcoming a kind of classical metaphysical dualism, you might say. But I think to fully unpack that, again, it's best to sort of follow Hegel's itinerary here. And here, I think we need to say a little bit of something about one of the peculiarities of his writing style, which is that he's almost always talking about other people's ideas, but he almost never uses their names. He has a tendency to sort of discuss major philosophical doctrines without attributing them to any particular author. Here, I think it's not hard to identify what kinds of movements he's discussing here. I think the three names that I would want to use as kind of the landmarks in the intellectual itinerary he's sketching out would be Spinoza, Berkeley, and Kant. And he gives each of them a sentence in this paragraph. But he doesn't name them. He doesn't actually tell us that, for instance, when he describes the conception of God as the one substance which shocked the age in which it was proclaimed, I think he's clearly thinking of Spinoza there. The idea, Spinoza's formula was Deus sive natura, God or nature. The idea that these two terms stand basically in apposition to one another. They're essentially synonyms. They're ways of describing or denoting the same thing from two different angles. And this, when Spinoza published his Ethics, or actually, I think they weren't actually published till after he died, they were received very, very scandalously. There's a famous confrontation between Spinoza and Leibniz, who was a much more conservative style of thinker. It was very, very suspicious of Spinoza's pantheism, which I don't think they even used that word very much in the 17th century. Instead, Spinoza was simply described as an atheist. He's collapsing God himself into physical nature. He's talking about the natural world as though it were the body of God, and that basically that was close enough to atheism for 17th century purposes. And so Spinoza's work was received very scandalously. But it's the shock that's important, and I think again Hegel's terminology is worth following here, his specific wording, the way God as the one substance shocked the age in which it was proclaimed. I think the reason that he avoids using proper names is that he wants us to think of these philosophical ideas not as something attributable to some lone thinker, but as something that the age itself needed to think. The age itself needed to pass through these doctrines. Spinoza is sort of the first step in a triad here, and we'll want to say a little bit about the Hegelian triad as well. But the next step is then a kind of reaction to that, which he says clings to thought as thought, to universality as such. And that the figure that I would take to sort of stand for that more than anybody else would be Bishop George Berkeley, the great Irish philosopher of the 18th century. I think a rather underrated philosopher and writer. He only wrote two very, very skinny little books, and the main thrust of his argument is that we no longer really have any use for the concepts of substance. The more we think about it, the more obscure and weird the idea tends to become. And we can actually describe experience, our experience of external reality, without needing to refer to any sort of underlying material substrate. We can, basically thought becomes the basis for all experience. Experience is itself nothing but ideas, right? And so the objects of our experience are just modifications of mind itself. And Hegel's retort, again, echoing, I think, his remarks at the beginning of The Science of Logic about the identity of being and nothingness. What Berkeley ends up doing is just painting mind itself as the underlying material substrate of all experience. And then this yields a third movement, the movement that I think Hegel more or less identifies with Kant, in which Kant finds a way to sort of rescue the concept of substance, but only by making it into a category of the understanding. In other words, substance is a concept that we can't not think. We always bring it to bear on our experience. It's a fundamental element of every understanding, but it's a feature of the understanding, not a feature of the thing in itself. So Kant, in a sense, solves the problem of substance, but only by introducing a completely new problematic. Only by, as Hegel says at the end here, depicting actuality itself in a non-actual manner. And I think what Hegel has in mind here is this doctrine of the thing in itself, which Hegel is constantly going to attack over and over again in all of his books. So again, we have here a case of, I guess, the classic Hegelian triad. But notice that the typical formula for it, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, doesn't really work here because, if Spinoza is the thesis, Berkeley is the antithesis, and Kant is the synthesis that brings it back together, well, that's not actually a very satisfying synthesis, is it? Because it yields a whole new problematic, an even deeper and more urgent and scary problem than the one of substance. So we never get to rest in any kind of a final resolving synthesis. The contradiction simply assumes a new form. And I think that's something that we're going to want to keep in mind every time we see one of these Hegelian triads, that the old formula of thesis, antithesis, synthesis really doesn't apply to what Hegel's doing here. We need to think a little bit harder about that.